Hey guys, so as usual, I wanted to bring a hand trap and staple tier list data video using Dueling Book data from YCS.com, as well as accounting for the cards that were played in the topping list from YCS Las Vegas, which I did a separate video on, so definitely go make sure to check that out. And also the formula in terms of the calculation. You can always check my older videos to know how it's actually calculated, because I've been doing it for a year. I don't really want to repeat myself. And so before we continue, a big thanks to my sponsors as usual, links and discount codes in the description below. So in terms of the tier list, let's just get right into it with tier A, and we do have Ash Blossom right at number 1 again. Has been so in a few months, but kind of nice to see it back, I guess, in terms of the traditional hand traps making its appearance again. Ash is of course very, very strong in terms of having a very high impact against Branded Fusion, but also it can stop Book of Eclipse, which is very played often right now in terms of combating Kashir, but kind of good against other decks as well. And it's pretty solid. It was really seen in a majority of the topping list. And then second is Evenly Match, which was another card that was seen a lot in the topping list from YCS Las Vegas, which you would know if you saw my other video. It's a really, really strong card. This match win percentage, 59%. Keep in mind, you have to be a little cautious when interpreting these values from YGOscope.com, because if this was the win percentage in that particular game when this card was played, then it would make more sense, but that's not how it works. It's more so the win percentage of that entire match if this card was played in any of those 2 or 3 games in that match. So it doesn't necessarily mean this card was the reason the win percentage was that high or that low, but still interesting to see. It is quite high. It's a big blowout card, although in terms of, let's say, something like Branded, where they will give you a card like Gimmick Puppet Nightmare, or let's say Kashtero, if they give you the Ibli, then you do control a card and you won't be able to use evenly, so it can get a little bit risky in that sense, but it's still so strong. Book of Eclipse, speaking about that, it's also a card that's been seeing a lot of play in most people's main decks even. I think coming into this format, everyone knew this card was going to be really good, to a point where Kashir players at YCS Las Vegas, they were actually, some of them were playing Forbidden Lance, so that at least, one of their monsters would not be flipped face down. A really strong card. Definitely don't forget to draw if the monsters get flipped back up in the end phase. It's very easy to miss that, but certainly a really strong card. But kind of curious if it will continue to see play as we move into this format, or if some players will start trying to find ways around it, especially Ash does stop it, and again Forbidden Lance, so maybe they go for other cards that are more surefire thing to stop their board. And another one is D-Barrier. This is definitely not a card that I want to see this high, but unfortunately, A, it just truly is that powerful on its own, but B, it's just seeing a lot of play because, a deck like Labyrinth, for example, they're main decking it, they can turbo this out quite easily, and when you have a format where Branded, for example, is one of the best decks, and it's very, very fusion reliant, this really kills them. And also Kashtira, they're pretty Xyz reliant, and then you have also Sword Soul, which is very Synchro reliant. All of the cards that D-Barrier can hit, it doesn't hit Lynx though, because this card came out before Lynx were ever introduced, so I guess if you're playing something like maybe like Dragon Link, you're kind of safe, but it's a really strong card. I do think this card will get banned in the next list. It's just far too strong, particularly in a format where a deck like Labyrinth can just use it so easily, and it's just not that fun. Harpy's Feather Duster. So of course there's no restrictions on using this card, and when you have a deck like Labyrinth being one of the best decks, and it's a backward heavy deck, it's gonna see a lot of play. The only potential downside rather, is that if they happen to have Heavenly Lord Prison that protects back row from being destroyed, at least set cards, this obviously won't work, but you probably will be able to use it later in that game, so it's really strong. Not too much to say about that. Nibiru also makes it to this A tier at the very end. It's certainly strong. I think you're seeing a lot of decks main decking this. For example, like Branded, you saw in that deck profile with John. He was playing it. It kind of works out nice for that deck too. Sometimes you just need that extra light to send to the grave. Let's say you already have like access to Rebellion, and you can now summon Albion Dragon using Nibiru. So it's always nice to have another extra light to spare. But it's a really strong card against Kashtira, for example. That's something that can really turn the tide against them. Although, of course, if they do have the Ibli available, then you will not be able to Nibiru. But I think it's a pretty safe choice for now. You never know. As the format evolves, might just kind of go out of play if decks are just able to play through it or play around it too well, and then eventually it just comes back, and Nibiru just has that paradoxical relationship. And on to B tier, we do start with the talents. Of course, it's a very strong card. I think we all saw how truly powerful it is in that previous format with tier element mirrors, and this card would just change things so easily on its own. Really strong, multiple effects. Usually, The draw effect probably is used not as much. I like to think at least that, you know, to take is just easy OTK and just really strong, and when you're going first you can just snipe a card out, for example. And related to talents is Thrust, a new one, which is also incredibly strong, especially let's say you're going first. Even if you can only set that card, if you set something like D Barrier, it's kind of game ending for the most part. And so really strong again in Sky Striker too, especially because they're going second deck and your opponent's most likely gonna have a monster. You know, you can like just get access to that engage even easier now. It's a really strong card, and kind of curious if this card will eventually get banned at some point. I mean, people kind of said that with talents too, particularly because it's basically 3 banned cards in one in a way. So maybe it never gets hit, but you know, certainly up there for contention, I think. Then we have Imperm, which was in the A tier in the previous format because it was just kind of that automatic, you know, really strong card against Kikalos or like Gigantic Strike. But both of those cards we don't really see as much anymore. Sprite is still kind of up there, but Tier Element's definitely not right now, and especially with Kit being banned. It's still a really strong card. Against Cashier, I guess it's kind of okay. And also against Labyrinth, it's not amazing, of course. And then you have something like Trap Tricks that are kind of coming to the mix. Are they tier 1 or 2? Maybe not, but you know, it's going to see a lot of play, especially during this, you know, kind of like hype period now that the structured X just came out. And Imperm is not the best, that's to say the least, but still a very versatile card. And I think at least consistently in terms of all the hand traps that are out there, this card probably saw the most consistent strong amount of play throughout all the different formats. And then we have Lava Golem. I don't think we've seen this card this high, even during, for example, Runic Sprite, when that was the best deck. This card was main decked, and so it was seeing a lot of play back then as well. And so it's really strong, can out really just anything that's problematic. Something like, let's say, for example, Dragoon is going to be something that you might see a lot now, especially with Branded and that, you know, those YCS topping lists, playing it and even main decking Dark Magician. And it's kind of hard to out for a lot of decks. Something like Dragoon or even something like Psychic and Punisher is actually very hard to out for a lot of decks out there too. And so Lava Golem, along with Kaijus, that sort of thing, is a way to get around that. Although it does use up your normal summon, even though the summon itself is considered a special summon. So it can only be played in certain decks, and that's why you never see it as much as you probably would if it did not have that restriction. And then we have D-Shifter, which is, you know, to be fair, in a B tier for this card is actually still pretty high because this is usually very exclusive to certain decks in terms of which decks can play it. And we've seen that, you know, last format with Flunder is very strong. The funny thing, or the more interesting thing though, is if you saw my YCS Top Cut breakdown video, you'll see that the list that were playing Shifter, none of them were main decking this card, which I guess makes sense, right? I mean, if you're expecting a lot of Kashira in that tournament, you know, it's not really going to do anything. At least in the previous format, you have Flunder, which, you know, even if there were a lot of Flunder, they were still main decking Shifter because Tier Element, they were still the best deck and they were getting destroyed by Shifter. So I think it made sense why so many players just opted to side this instead. But it's still, if it doesn't do anything to that deck and it actually has an impact, then it's going to be a high impact. It's a very strong card. And the OCG did semi-limit this, I think a few months ago. Curious to see if we'll eventually do that. I think right now it's decent, but yeah, I do think that, you know, it does restrict a lot of game mechanics and just a lot of different decks. So hopefully this does get kind of checked a bit in the future. And then we have Solemn Judgment. So this card usually doesn't see too much play, but now it does because we have trap decks like, for example, Labyrinth. And now we have technically trap decks coming into the mix as well. But at the time of YCS Las Vegas, you know, that was, the structure decks were not legal. So Solemn Judgment, obviously a very strong card, can stop most things. Interesting thing with this card I always notice is the win percentage in the match when it was used. And again, I did mention that disclaimer, it's not entirely reflective of, you know, whether it's that specific card, but Solemn Judgment, it's always quite low, I'm noticing. And I don't know if it's because it's not actually as good as people think it is. I mean, I don't think that's the case. I think it is actually really good. It might be more so that maybe the Rogue or even decks below Rogue tier status are more likely to use Solemn Judgment if that's the case, and that's why the win percentage just happens to be low. Kind of interesting to see, but, you know, still a strong card regardless. We do have Lightning Storm, speaking of backrow decks. This actually saw a decent amount of play at the YCS as well. Really strong. Again, Labyrinth, if that's a tier 1 deck, even though they can just resolve a lot of things, even if those cards were to be destroyed. For example, their Big Welcome Labyrinth or something just like Eradicator or Dimension Barrier, they can just chain things to it. But at least it just gets rid of those things. And it's really nice to have, again, that Heavenly Prison that gets really annoying if that can protect the back row. So that's why Evenly is a bit more preferable, and maybe even Cosmic Cyclone. And then on to the next tier, we do start with Super Poly. This is pretty much now seen mostly just in branded as probably a main deck card. Some are citing it, of course. Really strong card. Maybe it's going to see a bit more play if there's more Dragoon, for example. That's the easy way to out, because branded, they're probably going to have another Dark Monster alongside of Dragoon. So it was kind of declining in play lately, even into that tier limit format, even though originally in like Power of the Elements format, it was like a very, very big card, especially because it was good against Sprite too. But now, as busted as it is, it doesn't see as much play, but you will see this kind of guaranteed essentially in branded. And then look how the mighty has fallen. We have Bestial Magnet that's fallen to see the previous months. You know, this was basically like the #1 played hand trap or staple in general. It is still a strong card, of course, but just not to the same degree now that the best deck in tier elements, which really got hampered a lot by Bestials, that's out of the mix. And really, the Magnet, like the branded, or sorry, Bestials in general is just good against the branded matchup, but against Kashira, it's just awful, right? Against Labyrinth, I guess there's some utility actually, but you know, it's a pretty good card. In Dragon Link, you're gonna see this play a lot as well. And yeah, I mean, I guess not too much to say about that. Artifact Lancia is in C tier 2. I thought this would see a bit more play going into YCS Las Vegas because, you know, Kashira banishes a lot. I guess they can still set up some things though under Lancia. And to be honest with you, I think Lancia is actually quite good against branded as well. And the reason why I thought it would see a bit more play was because it's, you know, it can be effective, or at least have some effect against those top decks, but also it can stop Evenly as well, right? And it's something that sort of catches people off guard as well, because they just waste their battle phase. They're like, oh, I don't think they'll be able to stop this, but now you have that Lancia in hand to stop that Evenly. But so interesting to see. I don't think it's out of the picture just yet, but I think right now people, if they had to choose, are probably choosing Nibiru over Lancia right now. We have Call by the Grave. This is going to see more so, particularly a big play in branded, because Ash Blossom is very strong against branded fusion, but against something like Kashira, you know, they don't really have much in the grave for you to really banish. It's certainly a strong card, but definitely has fallen off since some of the older formats where this card was sort of a given that you'd be playing, and was, if anything, the most played card usually in any deck, but not so much anymore. I also decided to put Skill Drain here. Of course, not every deck can play it, but historically speaking, a lot of different decks, not just heavy back row decks, were able to play this card. For example, I believe even Prank Kids would play it, and even at some point in tier elements were playing this too, because they couldn't just get big bodies out without having to use monster effects on the field. And so it's a really strong card. You're going to see this more now with all these trap decks in the mix. Really strong card. It was something that Sprite had a hard time, for example, on this Skill Drain, but luckily as tier elements sort of came into the mix, Skill Drain was not as good in that format, and it sort of declined in play, but now it's back. So you really have to be able to play around it or play through it. Another one is Compulsory Evacuation Device. Technically, there was Dogmatica Punishment that was played more often than this card, but it's not to put that, because that card is a bit more exclusive in terms of what decks will be able to, or will want to play it, because of that extra deck summoning restriction the next turn. And so, you know, you can kind of argue Skill Drain is also not a card that every deck can side, but like I said, historically there's been a variety of different decks that would be playing it, and Compulsory is also more generic, but of course probably right now is being just more so seen in something like Labyrinth. It can be a very strong card. The bounce is kind of nice, because a lot of times nowadays cards, you know, they're like protected from like destruction effects, but bounce usually not. Targeting protection maybe, but it's kind of interesting to see an old card like this see a lot of play again. And fun fact that in the artwork, the thing that's being blasted out of there is, I believe, Gaga Gigo, so it's kind of cool. And then we have Cosmic Cyclone. I thought this would be a bit higher. It is certainly strong against something like Heavenly Prison that I mentioned in terms of being able to banish, as well as runic decks if they're seeing a lot more play because of the recent ban list. You know, Hugin can protect against something like Feather Dust or Lightning Storm, but Cosmic Cyclone can at least get through that and banish. So a really, really strong card that pay 1,000 life points. Usually not too much of a burden. And then we also have Book of Moon, which is similar to Book of Eclipse. Book of Lunar Eclipse did not see play, was not in this tier list, rather, because it was not played as much. But Book of Moon is pretty good as well in terms of, at least there's no restriction, or not restrictions, but downside of, your opponent would be able to draw off Eclipse. But Book of Moon, not really. It's just that one card though that you're gonna target. But again, now if Kashira players are playing Forbidden Lands, then it's a lot easier for them to just protect that one card that you were targeting. So that's kind of unfortunate. But Book of Moon has always been nice as well in terms of if you have any effects that sort of trigger on the normal summon, for example, and you can just Book of Moon it if they try to imperm or Veiler it, so that you can still resolve that effect. So it has some nice applications, but probably Book of Eclipse is a better choice right now, but really it depends on your preference too. And then we have Bestial Druid's Worm. So I actually think technically Serenir will be higher than this, but I decided to not include that one because it was more so being played more as part of, Branded's kind of line of play in terms of just sending that Branded spell or trap to the graveyard. I know it's a little iffy in terms of methodology. Perhaps I should just put Serenir on top, but Druid's Worm was next up, and also Baldrake, of course, is another good one. Druid's Worm was seeing a lot more play last format, of course, with Tier Elements, but its send effect was quite nice. Not too much, doesn't come up as much anymore now that the Bestial play is kind of low, but still pretty strong card. And then lastly in this tier we do have Effect Failure, just another hand trap, monster negation, similar to Imperm, not too much to say. Like I mentioned, in terms of Branded, it's always nice to just have another spare light monster if you need it. And it's also a tuner, so for some decks this could come up, and yeah. And then lastly, we have Droll and Lockbird. So this one's an interesting one because if you saw MST TV's video in terms of how, basically Kashira could add anything they really need through Small World, and whether Droll would come back and play. Of course, the downside of Droll is that you cannot use it under Shifter or something like a Rise Heart when everything has to get banished, because this has to get sent to grave. So that's probably why we're not seeing that much play, because otherwise it would actually be really good this format, I think, against Kashira, even against Branded, especially if they're on something like Edgem Chain Package and Allure. They're just trying to draw. Droll can be very, very strong, but I think right now Droll has always been very format dependent, and this format is just a little awkward for Droll because of so much play of Shifter or just other pseudo Macrocosmos like effects. And then we have Dark Ruler, which is very weird to see it being this low. Usually it's quite high, and it's just sort of like the most best generic, board breaking card out there. I think it's still pretty decent, but something like Lava Golem might be better if your deck can play it. And so, most formats this card is good, and it's gonna come back and play at some point. Right now, maybe not as great, but definitely don't sleep on this card yet. Okay, so that was it for the data tier list for this month. Hope that was useful, and hope you found that interesting. And as always, big thanks to my Patreons. Really appreciate your support, and well, take care, guys.